Good afternoon. I'm Carol Platt-Liebau, the president of Yankee Institute. Groucho Marx once said that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. At Yankee Institute, of course, we don't do politics, but it's our earnest hope that with our series of candidate trainings being held over these next 3 Thursdays, we'll be able to help with both the diagnosis and the remedies. Today, we kick off our series with a discussion of Connecticut's fiscal landscape, taxes and labor. Joining us are experts Jared Walczak and Vinnie Vernuccio. Jared Walczak is the Vice President of State Projects for the Tax Foundation. In addition to leading research on the annual State Business Tax Climate Index, he's authored or co-authored tax reform guides in a variety of states across the country. Jared's work has been cited in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, the AP, and many other prominent state and national outlets. F. Vincent Vernuccio, known at Yankee Institute as Vinnie, is a senior fellow at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He served as the Mackinac Center's Director of Labor Policy between 2012 and 2017. Vinnie also served as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Administration and Management in the Department of Labor during the George W. Bush administration. Vinnie, too, has published articles and op-eds in outlets including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Investors Business Daily, and others. He's also a frequent contributor on national television and radio shows, such as Your World with Neil Cavuto and Varney and Company. Before we get started, we wanted to let you know that we're eager to address your questions, and there will be time for them at the end. Please feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, type your questions in, and our panelists will address them during the question and answer time we've reserved. Thanks so much. And now I'm glad to turn it over to Jared Walczak. Jared, take it away.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be with all of you today. Appreciate the opportunity to present a little on tax policy and on a few specific things that are going on or being considered in Connecticut. I did not come prepared with a Groucho Marx quip, but I do want to apologize in advance. I'm about maybe 18 hours out from a wisdom tooth removal, so I think I'm going to get through this without muttering and mumbling. But if not, we can just turn this into a Harpo Marx routine, and I'll bring out whatever is necessary to get through this. But with that said, I want to talk a little about general tax policy and then bring it much more into the realm of Connecticut specifically. Because tax policy, like most policies that you consider, it's really all about trade-offs. There are some taxes that are probably bad enough that they should generally be avoided, and some that are neutral and efficient enough that they should feature in most tax codes. But for most taxes, it makes less sense to speak of the good taxes and bad taxes, and more sense to speak about the trade-offs that are implicit in them and how we balance those. Because tax incentives and taxes incentivize and they disincentivize certain behaviors. Sometimes they do that intentionally, often not. In broad terms, of course, you can think about taxing a few things. You can think about taxing capital, taxing labor, and taxing consumption. And at least on the margin, it's oversimplifying, but whatever you tax, you get less of. So taxes on capital, those are things like in the name, capital stock taxes, also tangible personal property taxes, the sort of taxes that fall on business property like machinery and equipment. To some extent, corporate income taxes also fall into this basket of taxes on capital. That's kind of split. Corporate income taxes are partially a tax on capital, partially a tax on labor, but they partially fall into this. Now, these taxes on capital all tend to reduce investment and capital accumulation. Then you have taxes on labor. The individual income tax is obviously one of those. Payroll taxes, and again, part of the corporate income tax fits into this basket. These reduce the return to labor. They increase the cost of labor, and therefore there'll be less of it supplied on the margin. Now, margin's always important in this. We're not saying impose a tax, everything disappears, but on the margin, that's where your effect is. And then you have taxes on consumption. They have less of a macroeconomic effect because their impact on capital and labor is second order, not primary. At least when the taxes on true consumption, they reduce primarily consumption on the margin to the benefit of investment. Now, we can think of those second order effects. If people consume less, that has effects throughout the market. But economists and public finance scholars tend to like true consumption taxes. They think they have less of an adverse economic effect and they're less of a thumb on the scale. Any decision that government makes on taxes is going to have some impact on economic decision making and behavior. True consumption taxes tend to have less of that, and that's important. In part because policymakers usually aren't equipped to be making those sort of determinations. There's a role for that in a limited case. Sometimes there are taxes that are designed to internalize externalities. But for the most part, taxes should be indifferent to the decisions people make. They should be about the primary purpose of taxation, generating revenue. And therefore, a tax's design matters. Fundamentally, tax bases matter. So on consumption, a well-designed sales tax is falling on final consumption. But most sales taxes tend to exempt large swaths of final consumption, while at the same time falling on a lot of intermediate transactions. This tends to pyramid, meaning that the same final good or service will be taxed several times over through the production process, increasing the cost of capital and making it less of a consumption tax because part of that becomes a business capital tax. Now, in Connecticut, there are a lot of exemptions. There's about $2 billion worth of sales and use tax exemptions that you might think of as being discretionary. These are not things that are necessary to make a sales tax work. These are things like exempting groceries, which is worth over $460 million in foregone revenue a year. Exempting prescription drugs, which is over $400 million. Exempting motor fuel because it's in your motor fuel tax, obviously. Though some states consider that worth taxing twice. They'll say there's two elements of fueling up. There's one, a Pigouvian tax, the sort of direct user pays tax for using the roads. You're putting wear and tear on the roads, you are contributing congestion, you pay for that through the motor fuel tax, and that funds the roads. But you're also consuming, just as a consumer. And some states will put that in the sales tax. That's another $400-some million foregone. And you can go down the line. We look at this as about $2 billion in foregone revenue. And why that's important potentially is to the extent that you could include some of these things in the sales tax base, you could have a broader base and lower rates. And that's good on the whole. I mean, that's a mantra you'll hear probably across the ideological spectrum, that ideally you want broad bases and low rates. Really what you want is a right-sized base. You don't want to tax things twice. You don't want to tax things that are business inputs, but within a tax, you want to tax what it's supposed to tax, its proper base. And the broader that base, the more neutral the tax is going to be in its application, the less it affects decision-making, and the less volatile it is for revenue. And you can bring that rate down, more equitable in the process. And especially when we think about a lot of the consumption that's not in a sales tax, a lot of it's personal services, especially once you get past like food. Personal services is a huge portion of this, and services tend to be consumed more by higher income individuals. So there's also a regressivity of the way we've currently designed sales taxes that could be addressed. Notably here, you think, well, the food tax, adding food into the base, that's regressive. It's actually kind of not. In fact, the only studies that we have on this suggest that it's a progressive change, amazingly enough, and that's because there's already a federal provision that says that you cannot tax any purchases that are made with SNAP and WIC. And when you get beyond that, if you are willing to tax the rest of unprepared foods and use that to lower the rate, it actually reduces the overall burden on lower and middle income taxpayers just slightly, not a lot, but it's not the regressive change. It's actually a moderately progressive change, as long as you're, of course, keeping that federally required provision. Income taxes. Let's think about this a little. So income tax in Connecticut, one of the last states to adopt an income tax. It was begun in 1991 and was largely designed as a way to reduce the sales tax rate, maybe address property taxes a little. At the time, sales tax rates were at 8%. Now, of course, that they went down to 6% there. And initially, that 2 percentage point decline in the sales and use tax was basically offset by what the new income tax raised. It was a close to revenue neutral situation. That's no longer the case because there have been a variety of changes to the income tax in the coming years. If the sales tax were still at 8%, it would raise an additional $1.06 billion each year. The income tax raises close to $10 billion a year, almost 10 times as much as the trade was originally supposed to bring. It's also a confusing and complex income tax. You have what are called recapture provisions. And I want to talk about these to illustrate maybe a bad idea in tax policy, because again, we talk about neutrality. I also would talk about simplicity. These things are really important. And you have 49 minor fiscal cliffs in your income tax through recapture. The first is what's called a 3% add back. It's on middle income earners. So Your bottom rate is 3% on the first $10,000 of income. But you get above a certain threshold, and suddenly that starts phasing out. So you get these little cliffs where it's adding, I think, $30 at a time. You earn one additional dollar, you pay 30 additional dollars in taxes at these different staggered rates to eventually eliminate the benefit of that first $10,000 being taxed at 3% and make it as if it was taxed 5%. Then when you get to the upper middle income levels, there's another phase out that increases liability in $90 chunks for each additional $5,000 worth of income, going for quite some time until you add up to another $2,700 in liability. And then for the really wealthy, those earning more than $500,000 a year, there's another 9 little cliffs. Ultimately, it increases your tax liability by about $3,500. And it's kind of silly. It's complex. I mean, reading the rules is confusing enough. This isn't really how you want to do tax policy, where you get these little cliffs where earning $1 means you owe $90 more. Even though they're relatively modest overall, it's not a good way to do taxes. And of course, the top marginal rate of 6.99%, it's fairly high. It's not enormously high, but it is fairly high, especially when you think of this in the context of a broader tax code that has relatively high taxes overall. And marginal rates do matter. Decisions are made at the margin, especially small businesses. They care about those top marginal rates. So obviously the ability to keep that relatively low is a good thing. Thinking and moving towards the corporate income tax, there's a couple of different components of your corporate income tax, and this is also a little unusual. You've got the traditional tax on net income. You also have an alternative minimum tax on net assets. This is what we call a capital stock tax in most states. So businesses pay the greater of 7.5% of their net income with no cap, or 3.1 mils of the value of their capital stock, all of their assets, everything they own. And there's a cap on that up to 1 million in liability. This disregards ability to pay. So if you're a smaller business, but still paying the corporate income tax, and let's say this is a bad year for you, this is a bad year for a lot of people, maybe you have no profits, but you have assets. You're still paying the corporate income tax. And that's potentially an issue. I mean, it's supposed to be a tax on profitability. This takes it away from profitability. It also means that you have to actually calculate the tax twice on 2 different bases. That's relatively rare. Most states are getting away from that. In fact, other states in the region have been getting away from that. New York will finish phasing out its alternative capital stock base next year. Rhode Island eliminated its. The rest of the New England and Mid-Atlantic states have phased it out. Pennsylvania was the last of the other Mid-Atlantic states. So this is unusual. It's something that is going away in a lot of states, but is still in place in Connecticut. You've also, of course, had these various surtaxes at different times where the highest income companies, the largest companies in the state, have paid an additional 10% or 20% of their normally calculated liability. And you have something else that's a little unusual. So corporate income taxes are supposed to be imposed on net income. And for individuals, individual income taxes, that's pretty straightforward. We know what your income is in a year. Corporations have a lot of fluctuations. They have losses in some years, they have gains in others. Some of them have these longer business cycles where you would expect that. And we have to do a snapshot. We've got to say, okay, you pay taxes based on your liability over the course of 1 year, but snapshots aren't real. And therefore, in every state and at the federal level, you have what are called net operating loss provisions, where you can carry forward and in some cases carry back a loss for a number of years, usually 20. At the federal level now it's unlimited, so that you can smooth out your gains and losses over time and pay on your true net income. Connecticut, however, has a cap on that. Yes, you've got 20 years, but you can only apply it against 50% of your net income in any given year, meaning you potentially can't use all of it, and you certainly can't use it for longer than you could in most other states. This is extremely rare. There's only 2 other states that have a provision like this, but both of them are actually relatively nearby. Pennsylvania's a little worse. Rhode Island's a lot worse. Everyone else, though, anywhere else in the country, you would not find a provision like this. Very unusual, very difficult for companies that might have several years of no profitability, especially companies that are just starting out. It's also bad for companies that just hit a bad patch. It's been particularly bad for manufacturing, but others have struggled with this as well. Property taxes, and on this I want to talk about both personal, I should say like residential and also business property taxes, and then talk about a paper that I have out recently that deals with specifically what you do about rising residential property taxes. On the business side, property taxes are more than 40% of most businesses' tax liability, and that surprises a lot of people. They think that businesses are paying the corporate income tax or whatever, and that's usually a small part of it. Property taxes, both tangible and real, are really important. Tangible property taxes are those that fall on things that you can touch and move. We're talking machinery and equipment and tools and parts and all of these different things. Now, Connecticut has exempted a lot of this. There's exemptions for manufacturing machinery. There's exemptions for inventory. These are really important. These are good things. And that's why tangible personal property is only about 5% of what you collect in property taxes. But it's taxpayer active. What it means is that everyone who has to comply with it has to keep this proper inventory of all of their property. They need to know what its acquisition year was, its acquisition price, what its depreciation schedule is, if there's been maintenance or changes that would affect its value. Some of this you already do for accounting purposes, but smaller businesses aren't necessarily doing all of this, and they have to for the tax. And it becomes this high compliance taxpayer active tax that often raises very little revenue. Exempting taxpayers with $10,000 of TPP, tangible personal property or less, would eliminate liability for 46% of those who pay the tax. And what would the cost be? Less than 0.15%. Let me repeat that. We're talking we're talking like 1/60th of 1% is what we're talking about here. Is how much you'd reduce your property tax revenue. Now, if you had a much higher threshold, say 200,000, you take 93% of the taxpayers off the books, but you would also lose about 11% of the tax base, so of the personal property tax base, so more significant. But still, we're talking about relatively modest revenue losses across the state and the localities for taking a lot of people off the books. At lower levels, like 10,000 or even 50,000, there's actually a decent chance that the administrative costs are more than you generate in revenue. Not true at 200, but at 10,000, almost certainly. At 50,000, it's pretty close. It's worth considering. You're also one of 17 states to impose an estate or inheritance tax, which can lead to outmigration. It takes about 3 years of lost taxes that people pay otherwise for you to lose more revenue on that than you'd gain if they stay and pay the estate tax. So it's this question: how many people do you drive out? How many do you keep and get both on? But there's a decent amount of research, which I'd be happy to point anyone to, that these things can be ineffective for a lot of states. On the personal side, the state's effective rate on owner-occupied housing is now among the highest in the country. It's about 1.7% of housing value. And I put it that way because millages can be really confusing because different states have different assessment ratios. They assess properties in different ways. You can't just compare rates from one state to another or even one community to another, but you can talk about what the actual effective rate is as a percentage of the fair market value of a house. And it's about 1.7% a year on average in Connecticut. That's one of the highest in the country. It's not quite New Jersey level. Pretty close. Basically, it's New Jersey, Illinois. You're up there with those states. You're also, and I think this is related, an outlier with having no meaningful property tax limitation regime. 46 states have some sort of property tax limitations that try to protect taxpayers from significant increases. You're actually in that number, but you are very, very narrow in what you offer. It's basically just the ability, if a locality wants it, and they usually don't, to phase in your assessed value increase. It's not a real restriction on the growth of your property tax burden. So what does this result in? It means that Connecticut residents pay 20% more than they would if they lived in New York on the same property, and almost 50% more than they would in Massachusetts. And we've seen this grow dramatically recently. We've seen Massachusetts and New York. The reason I mention them is they've both adopted property tax limitations. Massachusetts has had one for decades. New York's is about a decade old. And both of them have worked, and they've kept property taxes relatively flat while Connecticut's has soared, one of the fastest rates of growth we see anywhere in the country. Now, I've got a paper on this I'd be glad to share. There are different ways you can do property tax limitations, and this goes back to some of those questions about neutrality and efficiency and fairness that we always talk about in taxation. There are 3 basic types, lots of variations, but 3 basic types. You can have an assessment limit. An assessment limit is designed to limit the amount that your assessed value is about to rise in any given year, to essentially suppress the value of your property so that you don't get a surprise property tax bill. The rate limit is exactly what it says. It's a limit on how high the rate can go or how much the rate can increase in any given year. And then the levy limit, or sometimes called a collections limit, is an aggregate cap on the entire jurisdiction, saying we can only raise X amount of dollars per year or can only increase by this rate. So usually you might see that in terms of, every year overall aggregate property tax collections can increase 2% plus inflation or set your own rate. And if it's more than that, then we essentially do a pro rata reduction for everyone that year to keep it within that cap. Now, the assessment limit has problems. A lot of states have them. The idea sounds good. We want to keep people in their house. We don't want these surprise bills. What it ultimately means, though, is that if you've got a newer property, you've got someone who just purchased land, they might be paying significantly more than their neighbor with the same type of property just because of when they acquired it. You know, someone's property value has not been rising much for decades. The other person gets the real value. That creates a lot of inequity. It discourages people from selling and moving, and whether they're upgrading or downgrading. It discourages people from making significant changes to their home that might trigger that reassessment. So it has a lock-in effect. All of these things are bad. They're inequitable. And the states that have had them struggle with them and usually really dislike them after a while, but they're hard to unwind. Rate limits, they're okay, but they're actually really easy to circumvent because you can toy with assessments. You can toy with assessment ratios, you can toy with assessed values. They don't necessarily mean a whole lot. They're not bad, they're just not terribly effective. Levy limits, if you want to keep property taxes in check, are usually the way that makes the most sense because they're equitable. They are not, putting a thumb on the scale and changing the valuation of one property compared to another. It's saying that we're going to set a target rate of growth, and we're not going to grow beyond that. We will allow overall collections to increase by X amount per year above inflation population. And of course, new construction is always outside of that. So, you bring in a new major development, you're not saying that everyone's property taxes have to go down so you don't collect more because you've got this new development. The idea is that you're holding that, outside and saying how much is rising. This could be really valuable. And this is what Massachusetts has. They have something called Prop 2.5. It's not actually, that wasn't the ballot number 2.5. It's a proposition for a 2.5% increase. That's what they're allowed to do every year. If it's more than that, they roll back the rates for that year and keep it in check. New York has a 2% cap, and both of these have been really effective. They can be overridden if necessary. You can go to the voters and you can ask them to override. And what's really interesting about this is the voters will often say yes, but it changes the willingness of elected officials at the local level to do it. I think it's one thing for elected officials just to on autopilot accept increases. It's another to say, we really need it, and we're going to make the case, and we're going to go to the voters and say, this is what we want to build, this is why, this is important, do this. Voters will often agree with that, but it gets that participation, and I think it changes the degree to which you go and try to pursue this. So it's a transparency measure, it's an accountability measure. It seems to work very well, and when there is an actual need, I think generally speaking, the experience of localities is that voters care about their communities, and they will come through for a need. They just don't want the automatic increases when there doesn't seem to be one. So that's something I think to look at. Like I said, I have a paper on this that I published with the Yankee Institute that is out recently. I'm sure that Carol would be happy to share that. I'd be happy to share that. We talk about what the designs look like in other states, how you can do this effectively. But I think it's something very much worth considering because you're one of the states where property tax values are soaring, and we're not really seeing that elsewhere. You have maybe an advantage right now. If more people telework, maybe some people will be leaving New York and coming to Connecticut, but generally speaking, you've had an out-migration. And you need to find ways to make the taxes competitive. And I think I'm probably running out of time here. So I'm going to wrap things up and turn it over to Vinny, but I'll be on the call and happy to.
Great. Thank you, Jared. And Carol, Isabel, thank you so much for giving me the time. And thank you for everyone that's taken the time to listen in. I'm Vinny Vernuccio. I'm a senior fellow with the Mackinac Center and here to talk about some labor policy. And in Connecticut, it is a big deal. So I am going to start with the bad so I can end with the good. And starting off, Connecticut is actually an outlier in several respects. The first of which is this concept called supersedence. Essentially, what supersedence does is it allows public sector union contracts to override state law. And you heard that right. Without a vote of the legislature, a union contract can actually override state law. So you're probably asking yourself, how does that happen? It happens by a process called deemed approved. And this is something that the Yankee Institute has actually had a big victory on, but there still is some ways to go. So the education that Yankee did on deemed approved took it from the legislature simply saying that we're not going to vote on this at all to giving them a couple bites at the apple. So currently the way deemed approved works in Connecticut is that the public employer and the union will come together and they'll come with a contract, they'll send it to the legislature. Legislature can say yay or nay. If they say yay, then bam, it's law. It's a union contract. It's what the public employees are working under. If they say nay, it goes to an arbitrator to go and kind of iron out the differences. Then the arbitrator sends it back to the legislature, the state legislature, and the legislature can say yay or nay again. If they say yay, hey, great, now we have a contract. But the catch is if they say nay a second time, if they say no a second time, it goes back to the arbitrator to write the contract, and then it goes into effect. And when you combine that with supersedence, now an arbitrator has essentially allowed a union contract to override a law that was enacted by the people's elected representatives. So that's kind of this bad marriage of deemed approved and supersedence, allowing union contracts without getting affirmation from the people's elected representatives to actually override state law. So that's, I guess if you're talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, that is probably the ugly in Connecticut. So some of the other bad things that, basically border on bad and ugly are pensions. As you probably know, Connecticut has a really bad pension problem to the tune of over $32,000 in unfunded pension liability for each person in Connecticut, or 45% of the state's gross domestic product. In real dollars, that's about almost $100 billion in unfunded pension liabilities for the state. And by the way, with all the back and forth of the market, I know we're doing really well in the market right now. We were not doing well at the beginning of the year. These numbers are from the end of 2019. So kind of before all the COVID roller coaster in the market. So definitely showing that the state has some serious pension problems. And it comes from several factors. And, I know Jared touched on some of the tax issues there. First and foremost, the state is assuming an unrealistic, what's known as a discount rate. So essentially, how much they're assuming that they're going to get in interest or return on their investments every year. The teachers' pension system, for instance, assumes that they're going to make 8% on their return. I mean, I would love to have some long-term investments where I knew I was getting a guaranteed 8% return. I know probably many of you do as well. And rather than not to steal the thunder from the good at the end of this presentation, but one of the recommendations from Yankee is to actually average out 10 years and use that as the assumed discount rate. And for the teachers' pensions in particular, if you do the average from like 2006 to 2016, you're only looking at about a 4.8% return. And that is a far cry from that 8% that they're assuming they're getting today. And once again, all of this information is on Yankee's website, yankeeinstitute.org. And it's also in a study that I helped write for them in 2018 called Above the Law. And I'm sure we'd be happy to send anyone this information if you're interested. Another one of the issues that we're seeing is something just to be aware of on a defensive standpoint. Last year, the state legislature came very, very close to passing a labor omnibus bill that was actually in direct pushback to a Supreme Court case called Janus versus AFSCME that did two things. The case essentially brought right to work to public employees across the country. So basically said that everything that government unions do is inherently political, and because it's political, these public employees have a right to choose to pay the union union or not. And it also said that in order to take dues from a public employee's paycheck, Justice Alito said that employers need to set what's known as evidence of affirmative consent, or essentially evidence that the employee actually wants to pay. So what we saw last year, and I believe the bill came back in a little bit of a watered-down form this year, passed committee, then COVID happened, and it went by the wayside, was several things to push back on that Supreme Court case. And once again, Yankee did an amazing job of educating lawmakers and educating the public on some of the issues inherent in that bill, and I'm going to go through those right now. First, it said that unions would get what's known as captive audience meetings. So essentially think of like a timeshare presentation on steroids. Essentially, unions would have mandatory access to new employees to make their sales pitch on why they should join and pay the union. Adding to that, the law also, or the proposed law also said that unions were entitled to personal information of public employees, their home address, home cell phone number, private email. So not just being able to contact public employees at work to tell them why they should sign the card to join and pay the union, but actually being able to do that at their home, on their personal cell phone, on their home phone, on their personal email. It also forced what's known as dues checkoff. So remember, we were talking about the Janus case said that you have to have evidence of affirmative consent or that opt-in before collecting dues and giving it to the unions. This bill would say that employers would have to take that money out of an employee's paycheck and give it to the unions. There would be no wiggle room there for negotiation. Furthermore, it basically had almost a Hotel California provision in there, making it very easy to agree to pay those dues, but very hard to stop them. In fact, when the bill went so specific as to say that essentially you could agree to pay dues over the phone and a recording of that phone call would suffice. But then the fine print was if you wanted to stop dues from coming out of your paycheck, it would have to go with a typical union authorization, which we've seen in Connecticut and also other states, can actually limit when public employees can exercise their right to opt out of the union to several weeks a year or a month a year. So really limiting when they can opt out with artificial window periods and going through many steps to exercise their rights to opt out, but making it very easy to opt in. So there were other provisions in that Janus bill, but for the interest of, that anti-Janus bill, but for the interest of time, I'm just going to move on, but just know that there is a definitely pushback to that Supreme Court case to try to make it easier for unions to get forced dues from public employees and limit their options. So definitely something to watch out for. So that's mostly the bad. Now moving over to some recommendations and the good. Obviously, ending supersedence, making it so if a union contract is going to override state law, first, the state law should be changed. So have laws made by elected representatives, not law by contract. Also, contracts should only go into effect if they're approved by the legislature, especially if they're overriding state law. So yes, you should have arbitrators. They should be able to essentially mediate instead of arbitrate, try to get both sides to an agreement. However, you shouldn't have a position where you have a union contract that's overriding state law that's been rejected twice by the state legislature, but still can go into effect and override those elected representatives' laws. For pensions, we already covered a lot of this, but make that discount rate, that assumption, that rate of return, make it a 10-year average. don't assume fantastical rates of return or discount rates like the 8%, that 8+% that we're seeing today. Also, have public employees chip in more. Public employees do get some very good benefits by being public employees in addition to their job security. Those are benefits, benefits such as paying very little towards their pension and benefit plan, something that those in the private sector really do not enjoy. In Connecticut, for instance, teachers pay about 7% towards their retirement, but even Connecticut's neighbor in Massachusetts, teachers pay about 11% there, and that's not even counting the vast increase that someone in the private sector would have to pay. So just kick in the contribution a little bit more from those public employees towards their benefits and their retirement plans. And of course, the coup de grace would be getting to what's known as a defined contribution plan, or just think your typical 401k plan. So public employees are protected. They have an account with their name on it, with money that's deposited from their employer directly into that pension plan, and not being forced to gamble with these underfunded defined benefit plans where there could be issues going forward. So going from a DB plan, which is your typical style pension plan for public employees where they get a certain amount every month or every year, and move over to your more common in the private sector defined contribution plan where they're protected with an account with their name on it, and the state and the taxpayer are protected because they have that one-time payout and they're not on the hook for those future liabilities. Also, defend public employees' First Amendment rights against bills like we were just talking about with that anti-Janus bill that came very close last year, and thankfully COVID put the kibosh on it for this year. Other issues to be more proactive: increase union transparency. Unions in the private sector, or those unions with private sector employees, actually report to the Department of Labor their expenditures, their receipts, their officer salaries, and it gives union members a wealth of information on their union to safeguard against corruption, overspending, and things like that. Unfortunately, on a state level, that option is not available to many public employees. But states like Missouri and Kentucky and some other states have basically mimicked the federal union transparency law on a state level for public employees. So that's something else that Connecticut could look into. The last two recommendations, and I'd love to take questions at the end, is a concept called workers' choice, which over 67% of voters approve of in Connecticut. And that's actually giving unions something that they've been asking for. You hear in pushback to right to work to the Janus versus AFSCME case that unions complain, oh, we're stuck representing people that aren't paying us. The opposite from the employee perspective is also true, that they're stuck accepting union representation whether they want it or not. Now, with Janus versus AFSCME, no public employee in Connecticut is forced to pay for union representation, but they're still forced to accept it, and the unions are still forced to provide that representation, whether they want to or not, on both sides. So what workers' choice does is a very simple concept saying that for public employees in the state, if they want to negotiate their own contract, if they want to act like the almost 90% of workers in the rest of the economy that don't have a union contract, they can do so. And they can be treated as a non-unionized employee and have direct dealings directly with their employer. That's workers' choice. And frankly, it's something that, unions and their pushback to Janus should be embracing. I'm not sure if they will, but it would allow them to bypass, that free rider issue that they talk about and not represent public employees that do not want their representation and do not want to pay them. And the last concept I wanted to talk about is worker voting rights, also known as union recertification, which has the support of over 86% of Connecticut voters. And it's a really simple concept. It's basically union democracy. Just like you vote for president, just like elected representatives, the state legislature runs for re-election, just like the governor runs for election, we feel that unions should also run for re-election after they've certified and are representing employees. Most unions have been around for decades, and one of the interesting things that I've worked on is we've actually looked at when unions certified. And looking at Mackinaw's home state in Michigan, we looked at the top 10 school districts in Michigan, and it turns out that in some school districts, you're looking at like 1%, or in some even statistically speaking, not a single teacher was around when the union certified in the 1960s. So not wanting to say, well, zero for some of these, I actually looked at the career and life expectancy of teachers and figured out that almost 75% of teachers in these school districts weren't even born when the union certified. So you're not even talking about your parents' union, you're talking about your grandparents' union. So what worker voting rights does is it simply says, hey, just like you vote for president, governor, state legislature, Congress, the union should stand for re-election and workers should have the right to vote on the union at their workplace. So those are just some of the recommendations that we have. And once again, it's in that above the law study that I know we can forward over to you. Happy to take any questions, either online or offline. And once again, Carol, Isabella, Yankee, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present.
And now, gentlemen, are you ready to address some other issues and questions that we have that were sent to us in advance, or that anyone would like to add right now as well?
Be happy to.
Perfect. Jared, you want to jump into the fray?
Sure, I do see one question on taxes in the Q&A panel, and if others want to add them, please do. Asking me if it's true that Connecticut has runaway property taxes, something I had talked about, given what was referenced as a reputation for having low property taxes. And I can't really speak about that reputation, but I can speak about the numbers. Again, 1.7% of 1.7% effective rate is what you see as the average property tax burden on owner-occupied housing in Connecticut. The national average is 1.1%, so that's obviously significantly higher than the national average. It's also higher than most in the region. New Hampshire is very similar to you, but on the other hand, New Hampshire forgoes an individual income tax and a sales tax, so they're leaning really heavily on property taxes. In the same way, you're only slightly higher than Texas, and Texas is of course a low tax state, but by low tax, you mean they don't have an individual income tax. Their only corporate tax is something called the margin tax, which isn't a great tax, but it's pretty low. So you've got these states that are using the property tax as their primary source of revenue, or one of their largest sources of revenue, and they're in your ballpark. And most other states that have all of the major taxes are significantly lower. What's I think even more significant is that property taxes are rising in Connecticut as property values are falling. Nationally, over the last decade, property values have risen about 10% in real terms. They've declined almost 4% in Connecticut. But at that same time, property taxes have risen 19% in Connecticut in real terms. So you're seeing this increase in property taxes even as the values are going down. That's never a good place to be.
Vinny, is there anything you've received in advance, or that we've received in advance, that you think you should address?
Actually, Isabel's been sending me some great questions, so I think I might want to just jump directly into them because they're better than anything that I have in advance.
Okay.
So one of the questions are, can any reforms in other states be a blueprint for Connecticut labor reform? And the answer is absolutely yes. Reforms seen in states like Florida, in Missouri, even in Wisconsin, that have those provisions like union recertification that we were just talking about, putting limits on what unions can negotiate over. And frankly, that's not even a deep red state concept. Even New York and Massachusetts have some limitations on what unions can bargain over. They also put some safeguards on some of the pension bargaining. So yes, Missouri, Florida, Wisconsin, those would definitely be some really good role models for Connecticut. And even Connecticut's neighbors like Massachusetts, like New York, that put some guardrails and some safeguards might be a great baby step. Let's see, another question that Isabel sent me is, what about recusal for conflict of interest for state employees and union reps in the legislature? I think that is a big issue. And Carol, I mean, one of the things that Yankee has been very good about is highlighting state legislators that are either, current union employees or have very close ties to unions. And Carol, I don't know if you want to name names. I will shy away from that right now, but there definitely should be more conflict of interest issues with people that are either employed or getting money from unions when they're voting on union contracts or pushing for union issues. So definitely something that is a cause for concern in Connecticut and frankly several other states as well, where you do have union employees or union officers elected to the state legislature and being able to not just vote for, but actually champion bills that are protecting or benefiting their employer, the union.
And I would also, for newer candidates joining us on the call, I would commend to you a series written by Yankee's own Mark Fitch that was published last year, I believe, called Conflict of Interest. It's a two-part journalistic series that can be found on Yankee's website, which we'll be updating soon, actually, the website. I'm sure there will be other updates because we will, until we get rid of this particular conflict of interest as well with the journalism. But you can search for it on the website or just in Google and find it. And it does name names, and it also documents the problem chapter and verse if you want to get more conversant with us.
Great, thank you, Carol. And then I have two more questions, but Jared, I don't know if you have any that you want to address.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly. There was another question just posed regarding how Massachusetts and New York were able to pass levy limits and property tax limits, how they did that and whether it was bipartisan, whether it's popular. So in Massachusetts, it came out of a couple of things. Back in the 80s, there was some litigation in a handful of jurisdictions because of the racially disparate impacts of their the way that they were doing assessments. They were basically only doing assessments when local officials cared to and only where they cared to, which is an awful way to do things. And you had some jurisdictions, usually wealthy and white, that hadn't seen their assessed values rise in decades. And then you had lower income housing, in some cases minority owned, that had much more recent assessments. And you had situations where the newspapers were finding where you would have like $1 million home that was paying less than a $50,000 home in another neighborhood. And it was a disaster. And the courts required the state to do something. So they scrapped their old terrible system. And over time, there's a question, what do we replace it with? What do we do that is actually equitable, that limits property tax growth in an equitable and good way? And nothing happened for a while, but eventually voters got involved, and you saw this initiated approach called Proposition 2.5. Went to the voters approved it overwhelmingly. There was some concern and consternation at the local, at the governmental level initially. Is this going to work? Is it going to tie our hands? It hasn't. It's become something that's part of the culture in Massachusetts that is widely accepted and embraced by elected officials. I think a lot of local government officials feel that it's like the right amount of accountability, but still the ability to do what they need to do in local finance. In New York, this is something that was pushed very strongly by Governor Cuomo when he first came into office. So this is like 2011-ish, I believe, 2012. Was something that he had promised because there had been such significant increases in New York property taxes in prior years. So he tied it up with some other proposals as part of a larger package that made a number of tax changes, some increases, some decreases. It's what brought the current top marginal rate for the changes. It's been popular, it's been extended, and it's now been made permanent as part of the governor's most recent budget. It's now permanent provision, something that has been championed by members of both parties. That I think it's been very popular and very effective in that state. And this is really an issue that transcends like traditional party lines. I think property tax limitations are very popular. Unfortunately, though, the other thing that transcends party lines is sort of a grab bag approach to which type you choose. And New York and Massachusetts both got it right. They're essentially levy. Again, there's variations. Other states, both red and blue, have sometimes gotten this wrong. California was the first to ever do major property tax limitations with Prop 13. That's an assessment limit, a really aggressive one. And in my opinion, a disaster for them that's really hard to unwind. You could create nightmare situations for taxpayers if you just get rid of it. But you've created this really difficult situation for government finance, this really inequitable situation. So if you do it, which I think can be really good policy, make sure you get it right. And you've got two nearby states that are great examples of both the politics and the policy of it.
Okay, I guess I'll go to one of the next ones here. It says, would it make sense to consider freezing defined benefit plans for Tier 1 and Tier 2 state employees? It's a fantastic question and it brings up a great point that I believe that some of the newer public employees in Connecticut are on one of those defined contribution plans. And essentially, it comes down to how difficult it is to get someone in one of those pension plans. Clawing back defined benefit plan promises is extremely, extremely difficult. And I guess that is the hardest part, and I'm not sure if it's something we can look into today. But on the flip side, the easiest part is saying that all new public employees should be in a defined contribution as opposed to a defined benefit plan. That's the easiest. And then within the middle, there's differences of freezing defined benefit plan promises. So basically saying, okay, you've been in a defined benefit plan, you've worked for 10 years, your career expectancy is another 10. So we're just going to say that, okay, your defined benefit plan benefits are frozen at the 10-year mark, and then anything new, that's going into your protected separate account of your defined contribution plan. That's kind of the hybrid that's in the middle that, may make a lot more sense and frankly be a little bit easier than clawing back those defined benefit plans or buying them out. But with that being said, states like Utah have actually done some pretty interesting things and have done some great reforms on actually getting public employees out of defined benefit plans and into defined contribution plans. And I do think Utah is one of those great models that you can look at to how to fix an underfunded pension problem and protect public employees by giving them those individualized pension plans that are an account with their name on it and know that that money is theirs and protected.
All right, gentlemen, I think probably we want to be respectful of our participants' time. So does anyone have, either of you have one more question and then we will wrap it up?
Sure, the last question. Go ahead, Jared.
Go ahead.
Last question.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
The last question I had was, what is the biggest challenge to labor and pension reform in Connecticut? And I think the answer is really simple and quick to that. It's fear. It's fear of taking on a very moneyed special interest. but I would say rest assured that that fear has been felt in many, many other states that have gone through and enacted these reforms. And in all of those states, those that were championing the reforms not only survived, but they actually picked up seats. So fear is a big factor, and I'm not going to discount it. But in the long run, the bark is much worse than the bite.
All right. Well, we want to thank our panelists, Jared Walchuk and Vinnie Vernuccio. And most of all, we want to thank everyone who took the time to join us today on this call, and especially the people who make the effort to put themselves forward to serve our state. We're really grateful to all of you. And we invite you to join us again next week, same bat time, same bat channel, and we will be discussing economic recovery in the face of COVID-19. Thanks again for all you do for Connecticut. Thanks again to our panelists, and we hope to see you next week.